My role was Vice President of Business Development, so I reported directly to the CEO and Chairman, Mr. Jifan Gao. But I was really, wearing many different hats. And some days I was playing tour guide, other days I was, talking with investors on the IPO deals, at the roadshow. But there were other times I was absolutely in the weeds on supply chain issues, really trying to help secure upstream polysilicon supply. So the company became, arguably one of the top 3 global manufacturers and brands. It was the first really vertically integrated company that provided both, ingots, wafers, cells, and modules. And the IPO on the New York Stock Exchange was a phenomenal experience to live through. But I also saw how the company converted from being private to public, and also the ins and outs of that.
Today on the 108 Show, we sit down with global solar leader Andy Klump, whose 2 decades in China shaped not only his career, but his identity as a cross-cultural builder. Andy shares the moment that forced him to reconsider everything, learning that Chinese authorities had visited the supplier with his photo in hand, asking questions about his work. Though he had done nothing wrong, the message was clear. His growing visibility in ESG and supply chain transparency had reached a tipping point. From there, we trace Andy's remarkable journey, falling in love with China during a spontaneous trip in 2001, learning Mandarin, moving to Beijing during the SARS outbreak, helping scale Trina Solar from 30 million to 300 million in 2 years, and eventually founding Clean Energy Associates, a company that grew to 250 people across 6 P&Ls. Throughout the conversation, Andy opens up about the lessons that shaped him, the humility required to operate abroad, the art of building trust across cultures, the evolution from founder to values-driven CEO, and the courage to step back after years of nonstop work. If you are curious how a St. Louis kid ended up helping shape the global solar supply chain and what it means to reinvent yourself after a major chapter closes, stay with us. This episode goes deep. Andy, welcome to the 108 Show.
Thanks so much for having me here, Brian. I'm excited for today.
Yeah, I'm excited too. You've been on quite a journey the last couple of decades, so look forward to unpacking it all. So Andy, what is the 108 moment that you want to share with us today?
Yes, I love the theme of your podcast, and my 108 moment certainly involves China. But I was, I'd say, one moment away from having a very difficult encounter with the Chinese justice system. And that was a premise based on the type of business I was involved in, involving solar energy and energy storage. And the type of work we were doing in the past had been primarily focused on technical audits. But over the last 5 years, we were increasingly being asked to provide some areas of ESG, and especially the S, or the social and the labor component of the product, was in a lot of question. So I had been notified by one of our suppliers that there was a member of the Chinese equivalent of the FBI that was visiting their manufacturing facility and asking questions about me. They had a photo of myself and another executive from that manufacturer, and that they actually had presented this photo and were asking questions about who I was, my whereabouts. I also was aware the work we were doing could cause some potential disturbance in if there were any negative findings, and that was certainly something that was a big alarm for me. But it was a broader theme and indication that I should be considering other alternatives to living in China. And eventually, that was one of the reasons I chose to shift and move on to other locations.
Wow, it must have been scary, and you were clearly there for, sounds like, good reasons, or professional endeavors, but they saw other reasons that may have drawn conflict to that. For those, Andy, what I'm curious, and I appreciate the opener, I appreciate the story. When we were talking offline in a bit yesterday, you talked about as well being drawn to that part of the world, drawn to China in that culture as well. So even though there was a bit of a scare about you kind of being in the country, I'm just curious for those listening, I mean, you spent a great deal of time in that part of the world. So, like, what was the draw to China? What was the draw to being there and working there and just having a life and family there?
Yeah, so first of all, I had never been to China or even thought about going to China as a kid. Growing up in St. Louis, I vaguely remember there was a Chinese program that was offered in my high school. It was actually one of the first in the Midwest that offered Chinese back in the 50s. And I thought, why would I ever study Chinese? And I ended up taking French. And I always thought it was a peculiar language to go into. But lo and behold, roughly 10 or 15 years later, I was speaking with one of my friends who had traveled in Southeast Asia, and he talked about the amazing type of experiences he had. And so I took a trip to Southeast Asia right before business school in 2001. And every country I visited, I saw such a tremendous influence of Chinese who had settled there and were doing business there. And I just said, wow, on this trip, I did not plan to go to China, but I absolutely want to go to China as soon as I can. And then at that time, I started business school in 2001. I happen to have a classmate or I should say, a dorm mate who isn't that far from me in the dorm, who is from China. And so I just naturally became interested, asked a lot of questions, and I planned a trip in December of 2001 to travel to China. First, there was a school trip that was planned to go to Shanghai and Hong Kong, but I just was so excited by this. I'd never been to Asia out prior to my 2001 trip. I said the second time I really want to go deep into China. I picked up a little phrase book, was trying to study Mandarin in between my different meetings and taxi cab rides, and I was just so fascinated by the culture. I remember I started at 6 a.m. every morning, had a little breakfast, and then had meetings all day. I skipped lunches. I didn't even think about eating. And I came home at 10, 11 at night and realized I had not even had time for dinner, but I was meeting people constantly. I was engaged with companies. I was just fascinated in the culture. And I just was so in the flow. I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I said, while I'm in business school, now is the time to take a chance. Let me try it out for a summer. I ended up living staying at a friend's place in Shanghai in 2002, and just had 2 month work experience, and I had a month to travel. And after that time, I was just set. I said, I just have to go to China and experience on a full time basis. I've been studying Mandarin a little more intensively while I was there. I ended up taking the undergrad first year Mandarin program during my second year of business school. And so when I finished in 2003, I just bought a one-way ticket to Beijing, actually working for Dell Computer. And it was right during the SARS epidemic. And so the funny thing was I was seeing in the US news all the reports about the number of cases of SARS increasing. And I kept talking to HR at Dell Computer and saying, are you aware the SARS outbreak is getting worse? Are you sure things are going to be safe for me? And they're like, oh, no problem. It's all fine. Don't worry about it. And I said, this is a big concern that there's a little information asymmetry in terms of what they were telling me and what I saw in the international press. So I just had this early stage fascination really with Chinese culture, and also the fact that during the 80s and 90s, there literally were hundreds of millions of folks who had grown out of abject poverty in China. And I just said it was just such a fascinating culture. It reminded me of kind of growing up with very humble means in St. Louis, as my father was a taxi driver. And I said, wow, if I could be a part of or just witness part of this expansion, even if I didn't necessarily amount to much in China, I said at least would be a great place to be for a few years. So that was my origin story in China. Then lo and behold, 2 years later, I met my wife, who's from Dallas, Texas. She was also embarking on the start of her career. So we met in Beijing. We moved to Shanghai together, and then I stumbled on the solar industry, and that led to much deeper and closer involvement in professional endeavors that led to a lot of other good things. So that was kind of the early stage of my time in China.
Yeah, well, one, I appreciate you sharing the origin story because I haven't heard that from you yet. It seems like it was a bit of a one step at a time path, and the more steps you took, the more eager you became or more curious about the culture. And then eventually it was like, all right, I'm one-way ticket. I'm living there. I'm just curious, when you were, at the school and you were exposed to Mandarin, and, your roommate, the person that was living close to you who, spoke Chinese, do you kind of have this like internal feeling like, hey, maybe there's a life that's not here in America for me? Like there was a desire to live abroad kind of always there, or was it really just take a few steps and then all of a sudden I'm just full commit mode? I just want to understand that a little bit.
Yes, I will say it was definitely a. I mean, the first trip I took to China was such an epiphany, and I just got excited immediately at that point in time. But I will say, as I dug into it, I saw how difficult it was, and I remember on that first trip, I had all these cluster of meetings. Even before the school trip I was on, I arranged 16 different meetings during the course of two days, and I had a lot of people who were Chinese who were all encouraging me to come. They were very kind, warm, and receptive. Yet there was one expat who is a senior partner at PwC, and one of my classmates at the time had introduced me to him, and I was going into it with this eagerness and naivete, and just told him I was excited about China, really wanted to come. And he literally stopped me within 30 seconds and said, "Do you speak Mandarin? What experience have you had in China? What makes you think you're going to succeed here?" And I clearly said, "I don't speak Mandarin. I don't have any experience, but I'm willing and eager. And I think like my work ethic will help me." And he said, "No." He said, "This is going to be a complete waste of my time with you. And I'm telling you right now, get out of this office. Don't waste your time, and don't even think you're going to make it to China. Every foreigner who comes here has a really rough time. I've been here for 20 some odd years. I have struggled immensely, but I've seen so many people being torn up. You're wasting your time, and you're going to fail here." And with that, he stopped the meeting. Literally had 30 minutes on his calendar, but he stopped the meeting after 5 minutes. And I kind of went out of the room, and I turned to him and I said one last thing. I said, "I appreciate, sir, your opinion. I will come to China and I will succeed. And I appreciate your candor, and I'll take that into consideration, but I'm gonna make this path." And that one rejection from that one foreigner gave me that much more confidence to say, I'm gonna succeed, and I don't care what he's gonna say. I'm gonna find a way to make it. And there were many times during my journey in China when I was at Dell Computer and had a sales quota and was struggling to survive, and they told me I'd be fired if I didn't hit my quota within 2 quarters. I had 21% the first quarter, and it wasn't until 3 days before the end of the quarter that I nailed one big deal with BMW Brilliance JV in Shenyang in northern China. That's what helped me to make my numbers. But I remember sweating bullets and working my tail off 14, 16 hours a day. I would still wake up an hour early in the morning and an hour at night before I went to bed, and I would exclusively study Mandarin and just focus on learning the language, but more importantly, understanding the culture. And that's why those early days at Dell Computer were definitely transformational and helped pave the path for a lot of other things. But I go back to that other transformational moment was getting that rejection from that foreigner who later that was just a cause of my inner drive to say, I'm going to make this work, come hell or high water.
Yeah. Well, it's always nice when you have someone who tells you you can't do something, and for the entrepreneurial spirit, that always lights a bit of fire in you. And clearly that might have been birthed a little early in that moment, and you prevailed, so to speak. So I want to dive in. So before we do, I want to dive into the career and what unfolded. It'd be great to hear how you met your wife, all the things. But you shared yesterday too something to the extent of America, how America sees China as, there's a lot of perhaps misconceptions or things that aren't, maybe true. I'm curious from your vantage point, being back in America now, reflecting on your experience in China. Weren't you also in Thailand as well? Is that in?
Correct, correct. So after 19 years in China, we were in a 2 month lockdown where we were not allowed to leave our apartment compound,
Yeah.
and many foreigners chose to leave during that time. We were in that group. 90% of our friends left, and so I was still running my business, and so had to choose where else to live in Asia, and so we chose Bangkok
Yes.
for the last 3 years. But getting to your point about American misconceptions of China. I remember early days in 2001 when I told my dad that I was going to stay at my friend's house in China and in Shanghai. And he said, he looked at me and he said, "Do they have dirt floors in their apartment?" And I said, "Dad, it's the 22nd floor of a 40-story high rise. So I can assure you there are no dirt floors there." And it was just kind of common at that time to find folks who had vastly, different understandings of what China was about, even though China had succeeded in industrializing massively in the 80s and 90s. I think at that time it was still early on. I think everyone is aware that China is the number two economy in the world, and they are a juggernaut. And I think many Americans have still some misperceptions that China is still very state-owned run. It is a communist government, but it has been very entrepreneurially driven, and the Chinese entrepreneurs are some of the best entrepreneurs I've seen in the world, and I've had a chance to work with some of them very closely. Most notably at Trina Solar with the chairman and founder, Mr. Jifan Gao. But I still think the U.S. doesn't fully understand a lot of the dynamics around how the supply chain is built. This is not just built on massive government subsidies. And while there are subsidies that do exist, their subsidies exist in a lot of countries around the world. But what the Chinese supply chain has done is they really created this very irreparable, or I'd say very difficult to copy environment where just literally the whole ecosystem of that supply chain co-locates around one core manufacturing facility. And that's where I think the U.S. has really lacked this long-term vision of a broad industrial policy. And while we've had different spurts of incentives around manufacturing, that has not been as well planned out. And I think the Chinese have taken a very longitudinal approach, thinking several hundred years down the road about what they want their society to be like, and made those plans. I do think the U.S. is much more committed to manufacturing now than it ever has been before, especially for critical industries. And that's where I do feel, as of my 20 plus years of experience in solar and energy storage and in manufacturing abroad, can actually help as the U.S. builds out our supply chain and relies more on domestic manufacturing for a lot of those key components. So that would be a long-winded answer to your question there, Brian.
Yeah, no, I mean, one, I appreciate the perspective. I mean, both from a work perspective, but also just, how, America and China, the relations there, I know are very complex and complicated. But it seems like what you were saying is, China, at least from your domain expertise, like they don't rely purely on government subsidies. And perhaps the U.S. could learn a lot from how China, the Chinese did manufacturing and solar, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yes, very much so. I do think the U.S. has succeeded in supporting some parts of the supply chain. Certainly, module assembly, which is the final step of the solar modules, there are many of those facilities. Currently over 50 gigawatts of facilities right now. But it's some of the upstream components, particularly cells, upstream ingots and wafers, that have been missing. And so there are other parts of the supply chain that still need to be built out. On energy storage, I'd say the same thing, both the module pack and the cell processing. Like those pieces still have not been built out. So as the U.S. plans its manufacturing build out, it's also important to understand it's very crucial to have the talent and bring the technology in, because a lot of this technology is sitting outside the U.S. right now.
So I want to talk about as well, the bit of the professional journey in China. It sounds like you started at Dell, then you moved into, you said Trina Solar with a, very, profound entrepreneur. I know you also started a business, which we'll get to, but tell us a little bit about Trina Solar as a company, some of the key learnings and developments for you there. Sounds like a very formative professional opportunity in your journey.
Absolutely. And that was really my firsthand experience in living in a fourth-tier city in China. Changzhou was a very small town between both Nanjing and Wuxi at the time, which were larger manufacturing hubs. But Changzhou grew and expanded quite extensively. And so I joined back when Trina Solar was roughly about 500 employees, and so we worked out of the manufacturing facility. We had an old inventory warehouse where we just kind of were holed up in a corner, and it was amazing to see the company and also the industry grow during those 2 years that I was there. But yes, absolutely, there was a 10x growth curve on pretty much every metric of the company. My role was vice president of business development, so I reported directly to the CEO and chairman, Mr. Jifan Gao. But I was really, wearing many different hats. And some days I was playing tour guide, other days I was, talking with investors on the IPO deals, at the roadshow. But there were other times I was absolutely in the weeds on supply chain issues, really trying to help secure upstream polysilicon supply. So the company became, arguably one of the top three global manufacturers and brands. It was the first really vertically integrated company that provided both, ingots, wafers, cells, and modules. And the IPO on the New York Stock Exchange was a phenomenal experience to live through. But I also saw how the company converted from being private to public, and also the ins and outs of that. So, but Trina was well known, I think, at the time I was there, and still remains to be a very internationally minded company. I give the credit to the CEO and founder, Mr. Gao. He did not speak English at the time, but he did know and understand the importance of international markets. And he recruited myself and a few other foreigners to really be a part of the key team. Stephen Ju, Arturo Herrero. We had many others who joined and really kind of built this international culture within Trina. And I do see how the Chinese have dominated in the solar manufacturing sector, and their brands have really become more known as global brands. So there is a lot that Trina did those early years, but the industry also grew by leaps and bounds. So it was pretty incredible to be a part of that growth curve.
Yeah, I mean, you said 10x, on every metric. When you entered the company, how big was Trina, and what was your role when you first started?
So the company's manufacturing capacity was roughly 75 megawatts of capacity, which made that, if you're not an industry insider, you don't really know, but that's a very small number. It left very close to a gigawatt. We had about 500 employees and grew to 5,000 in those 2 years. The revenues are roughly 30 million, and by the time I left, they were over 300 million. And it was just fascinating to see how we grew out of this small warehouse, just handful of office workers, then all of a sudden having to grow and expand offices internationally, and really, just try to catch up with the growth. And a lot of this was driven by demand that came from Europe. But Trina did understand and know that they had to be global. And so part of their thought was bringing myself on board is also accessing the U.S. market. And while the U.S. was quite small at that time, it did grow and expand. But I will just definitely tell you, is there are a lot of fun stories. Those early days, I remember there was one case where we had a Spanish woman who came to the office. It was literally my first or second week in the office. And I said, "I'm sorry, I'm happy to see you there. Are you waiting for someone?" He said, "Oh, yes, I'm waiting for the sales manager." And so I went to the sales manager, and he was sitting in the corner. His name was James. And I talked to him in Mandarin. And I said, "Well, the customer's waiting for you." And he's like, "That's fine. She'll be there after I finish my coffee." And I said, "Well, no, why don't you bring your coffee and offer her some coffee and have a coffee with her?" And then I realized I went with him, and I realized he barely spoke any English. I was there translating and trying to help out, but literally we had customers waiting outside the door. And so after our meeting, she asked her request, and we said, "Look, we're sold out. We can't help out, but we'll be back in touch." And so meanwhile, she was very kind, thanked us, and said, "Could you direct me to the restroom?" And I said, "It's down the hall." And then she went in, and then she kind of came out a little bashful and said, "I'm sorry, is there any other female restroom with a Western toilet?" And I said, "I don't know. I've not been in the women's restroom." And so unfortunately, there literally was just a Chinese style toilet, which was a squat toilet, not a seated Western toilet. And so I apologized and I said I asked around and there was nothing else. So I literally wrote a bilingual note to the management team. And I said we need to install an international toilet. And I went to the management team meeting like an hour later, and everyone laughed and said, "Oh, here's Andy, our new plumber." So I was the reason that that Trina installed the first international toilet, and it was just really rough around the edges on all fronts, having to rewrite the website, marketing materials, just many things to get ready for just international business.
Yeah.
My good friend Arturo Herrero was part of the growth in those early days, and so he knows some of those stories, but it was quite an epic period of time and a fun moments, but we grew through those and learned a lot.
What I want to remark on was the growth from 30 mil to 300. I mean, sounds like serious growth, but I love hearing also like the fireside stories. But I also think what's super interesting is the international expansion, right? Like it sounds like you really had to see this business now from all sides as you went into new markets. Europe, you said drove was a pretty large part of the expansion effort. What when you think about international expansion, did you know what you were getting into? Did you understand the market dynamics? Like what did it take for the business to really prepare itself, right? To be prepared for interacting with other parts of the world?
I certainly did not know what I was signing up for when I joined, and there was a lot of just flying by the seat of your pants, the type of activity. So just the example I gave, I had no idea this customer was going to be there. Had to change my schedule and pay attention to them, but also had to really understand, the sales and marketing dynamics and try to figure out how do we shore up the right talent and team to really take on these new markets. So I was also flying around internationally with the team. I helped the CEO when he went to visit customers and really gain a better understanding of how to interact with different international foreigners. Sometimes it would be about translating to the board, who we had a Swiss member who is Dr. Sven Hansen, who is a tremendous investor and board advisor, and he came from the industry. But there are also times where there was very tense moments between him and the CEO. So I had to be very careful in choosing my words on the translation because I saw the two of them kind of fighting back and forth on a key topic, and they're trusting me here with this translation. But I also wanted to be delicate enough to to kind of temper both sides and make sure that they weren't fighting too much. But look, I mean, the reality was we had to continually shift on a dime. Customer requests were constantly changing. Market pricing was changing, both in terms of our upstream supply as well as our end product. And so it was very difficult to appease different customers. And then we had to go through the process of going public and meeting the needs of international investors who wanted transparency into our pipeline. It's how things were growing. And we did not have the right ERP or CRM systems to really give us forward visibility. So it was this constant effort of changing and trying to be dynamic. And so it required a lot of hard work. And so, to be honest, I took the 7 a.m. bus to the office every morning, and I would often be leaving on the last bus at 10 p.m. Or sometimes I get a ride with the CEO at 11 or midnight, sometimes 1 in the morning. And so we would just have to grind through a lot of hard issues just through the day with that customers were awake, and then on the backhand, kind of coordinate with the internal team. So it definitely tested my patience, and I learned a lot. But that's what made the industry so dynamic, is that everyone else was impacted the same way. And so we constantly had to figure out this co-opetition model where sometimes you were exchanging some subcomponents in the supply chain with someone who had more than you did, to try to figure out how to meet your numbers. And so there was a sense that there was a certain camaraderie with others in the industry, but everyone is out, being as disciplined as possible to grow and ramp the industry. So yes, it took a lot of dealing with international time zones, and eventually, when I set up my own business, CEA, I had to kind of replicate this same model of saying, look, I need to build an international team in China that could really help translate to the rest of the world, and that's where I thought part of my value was being that effective bridge and really being a multicultural bastion amidst an all Chinese environment. And that's really where I came up with the idea of setting up CEA, is because I saw how quality was completed, and it was generally missed by the international inspectors who would fly in. So the typical model was that a technical inspector would fly in from Madrid. They'd be jet lagged. They'd be seeing some of the factory a little bit groggy. They'd be wined and dined. They wouldn't really see what was going on, but in a 2-day audit, they checked a bunch of boxes and said everything's fine. And then I saw the workers, have a sigh of relief. They polished all the equipment, made sure everything would look great in the tour, and they said, okay, now let's get the half-finished product that we need to send out. Let's bum rush this out because we're up against a deadline. And so there was just very different dynamic. And I said, if there was a need for someone who was on the ground, who could really, you could kind of communicate across both cultures, but understand what was going on in the manufacturing ecosystem and to give that transparency to customers. And so that was really the genesis of my my business at Clean Energy Associates.
Yeah. I know there's a whole advising component to it from some of the things I read. So that makes sense. And what's neat is, right, you could take so much experience from Trina on the ground, have your hands in a lot of dirt, and then it sounds like recognize some gaps and needs, and then say, you know what, like I want to start, my own thing. Now, what made you, obviously there's a genesis to starting that makes sense, but was it always top of mind for you to say, hey, I really want to build, my own business, and my own entity? Or did it really just kind of strike you? How would you answer that?
I definitely had entrepreneurial aspirations. I still remember as a kid running my own landscaping business at the age of 12, and Handy Andy's lawn care services was my first shingle, so to speak. But it was just a way to pay for high school. I did not look to professionalize or do it beyond the 7 summers I was there. But I did want to go and do something more entrepreneurial. But it really wasn't until mid 2008 I just said, look, for the sake of my time at Trina was just coming to a close. I've been there for a little over 2 years. I love the team. I love the board. I loved a lot of dynamics. But I just realized it was just too hard on my wife, where I just got married and I was away from her constantly. Literally 90% of the time was away from Shanghai, either on international travel or at the factory. And I was always promised, we'll set up a Shanghai office, we'll relocate the headquarters there, all decision makers will be there. And that just, the office was set up, but just decision making was still in Changzhou. And so I just said, look, it's not going to change. And for the sake of my family, it was just my wife and I at the time, I said, I just have to prioritize that. And I would rather, just test about my own entrepreneurial drive. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I chose to set up the company right as the economic downturn happened. The global financial crisis of late 2008 had just started. The solar industry was in free fall. Pricing dropped dramatically throughout the whole supply chain. And there was this constant question of like, what's going on? What's pricing today? How do you meet the needs of our clients? And so I had a lot of ex-Trina clients calling me. And so while I had the vision of setting up a company doing consulting and maybe, strategic planning, something more in the mind of my kind of MBA classmates, I realized I was just being pulled into very tactical supply chain and quality challenges. And I said, great, let me just set up a business, just focus on these two things. And that was really those were the 2 core tenets of Clean Energy Associates. And that's what allowed us to be successful, is by focusing on just basic customers' needs and trying to feel the market and try to help make sense of what was going on, and literally being an actual communication bridge in terms of speaking Mandarin, but other times just being a cultural ambassador and explaining what was going on in the decision-making cycle and helping advise clients on procurement supply chain decisions. So those were the origins of why we CA came about and how we ended up differentiating ourselves.
If you are a founder looking to grow without raising capital or giving up control, Relent is built for you. Founded by entrepreneurs who've scaled without outside funding, Relent helps companies find and retain talent, lower operational costs, and reinvest in growth. We've hired nearly 10 team members through Relent and streamlined our entire cost structure, freeing up capital to put toward what matters most. Even small teams can set up offshore operations quickly, compliantly, and without heavy infrastructure. With deep expertise in the India-US corridor, Relent combines cultural fluency with operational rigor and guides everything from team design to long-term scaling. Grow on your terms and start with Relent. To learn more, visit relent.team/arcbound. As you were talking, about the two areas of focus with CEA, for the audience maybe who doesn't know as much about supply chain, manufacturing, solar, as much as you do, I'd be really curious if you could maybe share a couple of tangible examples of the use cases when companies approached you guys, and then you said you felt out the market and sounds like designed some nice solutions, and you were a bridge as a translator as well. But what were the use cases around the supply chain that you were maybe most drawn to, or helped companies solve problems around?
So I remember there was one manufacturer who I was trying to work with on behalf of a German client, and they had it was very small, 1 megawatt order, and the price point it was just literally we had all agreed on pricing, went back and forth on documents. The time for the signature came, and the supplier said, "I'm sorry, we're going to raise pricing because we now have a higher offer in another country." And I had to go literally call the CEO of that manufacturer. I knew he was behind the scenes working on this, and I said, "Look, I know we've only met once, but I can assure you, I have worked with this client for several years now, and I can assure you they will never work with you again, and your reputation will be marred in the industry if you go back on this, because this was agreement. They had just visited China. We just exchanged documents and agreed on everything. So you can have your higher price if you want, but it's going to have a negative impact on your reputation and any clients that I touch." And he actually stopped and he listened to me. He said, "Okay, I will. We'll agree with the contract, but I want to make sure that that we're a trusted partner. But if you weren't here, Andy, I wouldn't be doing this." And so it was a surprise to me, but it made me realize, even just with just a few years of experience and just some trusted relationships, my opinion and input really mattered. And so I saw that exact same case study play out time and time again. And I would always encourage clients to come and visit the factories, but more importantly, meet the executives, share an evening with them over dinner, have very bad tasting baijiu, which is the Chinese wine, or hard alcohol, that folks in the factory would drink, and it just like that type of connection really made a difference. And so as our volumes grew from 1 megawatt to 10 megawatts, a gigawatt type contracts, I saw these trusted relationships really grow and expand over time. And that's what made the mark of CEA great, is we really hired and built a team that was very strong at kind of building and forging that bond across both cultures. So that was really crucial.
Yeah, wow. It's cool. It's neat the way you speak about it. And clearly, I mean, it sounds like you hired a lot of people you were a translator yourself, but it sounds like you had a lot of other people who had deep expertise across these industries, and then could also be the translator, to these different companies as well across these core issues. So, you mentioned to me, when I think it was yesterday, you said you had a team of, was it 200? 250?
Correct. At the time I sold the business in 2022, we had roughly 200 professionals, and we eventually scaled up to about 250 professionals. But we sold the business because we were a 6 division, 6 P&L run business, and had a lot of different areas of value creation. But yes, we had team members in 15 countries, and we were acquired by a company, Intertech, that had 1,000 test labs in 100 countries, very global, international, 44,000 person company. So while we were a very small portion of their overall headcount, we were very strategic in terms of the growth and in terms of the type of services that we offered.
Got it. Now, you said 6 lines on the P&L.
Or 6 different P&Ls.
6. I mean, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I meant 6 different P&Ls. So many business units.
Correct.
What? Yes. Must have not got. I went to bed early last night. I'm struggling here today. What were the 6 lines of business? Just so I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so the first two lines of business were really the quality control or the quality assurance piece, which is where we were doing basically all the factory acceptance work and actually monitoring production, inline production monitoring, pre-shipment inspection, other services that were in the factory. The second core business was supply chain management, or which was really more procurement advisory. So those were kind of the two basic tenets of our business. We started doing that in solar. We then later set up a business doing engineering services because a lot of our business at the start was really focused on the upstream work around factories and decision making. We then had clients in the US and other countries who said, hey, can you help complete inspections actually in the field and really play a role of a broader technical advisor? And so it was a much larger total addressable market, and that TAM was massive. There are other big competitors, but we went and really focused on how do we do inspections at both utility scale and rooftop installations for a lot of large companies like Walmart and Amazon. We then set up a business that was providing market intelligence because we had such data and knowledge about what was happening in the ecosystem, both upstream and downstream. We codified a lot of that data and then sold it and then gave folks insights into what was happening in the market. We later then set up a business really around ESG and traceability. And that was what I kind of alluded to at the start, but there are a lot of demands for folks who want to know was there an ethical supply chain practice in place of the manufacturer, and how do you trace upstream products? And so that ESG team was later formed. And then we also had a practice around energy storage. And so we had all the products in 5 areas I mentioned. We did this for both solar and energy storage, but we also had a standalone P&L energy storage because there were certain scopes of work that required energy storage professionals. So those were the six business units that we had. And running each of those as separate P&Ls was beneficial because allowed it really kind of decentralized the business. So decision making wasn't centralized just to myself. And that was really the other transformation of CEA, is really building a team and a culture that could last well beyond my time there. And that's why the business was sold and still is excelling today.
That's amazing. Wow, I had no idea after these conversations the last 2 years that it was so expansive and all the different things that it did. It makes also a lot of sense having decision making kind of spread amongst different divisions where they don't rely on you. So it sounds like it could move a little bit faster. But the progression to the business units also make a lot of sense, and seems like evolved as we evolved. And I mean, ESG was the ESG line. I'm sure that was a more recent one, given kind of where we are today. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
That certainly was very relevant. And once again, this did go into other areas, ESG involving kind of carbon accounting and other areas involving what's the overall carbon footprint of the product. And so there's a lot of other areas of ESG that still have room to grow and expand. But I would say the core tenet of our business was really the upstream quality control and QA/QC, and Intertech being a testing, inspection, certification business. That was their primary interest in the business, but they saw that a lot of these other services were cross-sold or upsold, and so we really offered more of a solution approach to our clients rather than just doing a one-off piece of the business.
Totally. And just to build on that, you talked about the culture and how, hiring for all those different units, obviously your core lines of the business, but, what were you looking for in different people, right? As you built each business unit, what were the, tenets, I'd say, of your culture and how you're able to grow and scale the organization? Because sounds very, service oriented, people centric, and so I have to imagine the people behind it were some of the most important assets.
Absolutely. So there were 8 core values that we had identified at the later stage in CA's culture. But I should probably back up a second. I'll talk about those in a second. But the real key transformation happened. I'd say there's 3 areas of culture transformation of the company. The first was I set up the business in the middle of the economic downturn. I did not establish any culture. A culture existed. It was a very hardworking culture and one that was very client centric, but we didn't codify any of our core values. Then the second phase was when I had an intern by the name of E, who came and asked me. He said, "What is your vision? What's your core values? where are you taking this company? I said, I don't know, but that sounds like a great project. Let's assign that as an intern project. So we sat down as a team, and over the course of a couple hours, we brainstormed four or five different values related to sustainability and integrity and a bunch of other words that really didn't matter. We set those values, like, went up on the wall, but they basically sat there and didn't exist in anyone's memory, including my own. But then in 2015, I had an epiphany. I realized the business had grown to roughly 50 folks, but we could not break beyond a certain barrier, and I had to reinvent myself. And so I also had to reinvent my priority of the culture. And so I hired an executive coach, and he led a 2-day exercise where we had 16 members of the team come together, and we focused on identifying, articulating what our cultures were, what our core values were. So we are family, have fun, unending curiosity, be humble, do the right thing, results matter, own it, perform above and beyond. And those formed a 2-letter or 2-word acronym called WUB drop. And the next morning after we identified these, I took a mug and I gave everyone a thumbtack and I said, "This is a WUB. I want you to drop it in the bucket." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And then we had agreed on the 8 core values, but we had them in different order. So once I put them in that order and everyone took a WUB and dropped it in the buy-in bucket, then everyone understood, okay, now we align with our values. We announced those at the company, and those still remain alive and active in the company today. But during that last phase of 10 years from 2015 to 2025, I learned that we had to not just have a culture written down and documented, but we actually had to live it. And so we celebrated the core values. We used those in our hiring practices. We went through and identified success stories, and we gave awards based on our core values. So once everyone saw our culture was alive, then they knew as they stepped into the company what they were signing up for. And those that did not want to be a part of it, that's fine. They moved on. We had no issues with that, but we at least had a very clear culture and identity. And that's really what allowed us to grow and scale. And it took us about 2 years from 2015 to 2017 to adjust the old way of operating to this new way of really embracing values. But that's where we went through the high growth trajectory, growing 59% one year. We were larger and grew 74% the next year. And then we were scaling up until COVID happened, and that disrupted some of the growth rate, but the culture remained very strong while we worked independently. It's separated by the travel restrictions at the time. And that really was the transformational point in 2015, the decisions we made that allowed us to go to this high growth trajectory and scale and grow as a successful technical advisor.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing the leadership journey you went down. Sounds like you realized that for the company to grow, you needed to maybe disrupt a lot of the things that you were doing, and also put in structural behaviors that allowed the organization to grow as well. You hear that story every so often, but I think the journey makes sense. I mean, you're so heads down, and you don't realize how important that is until it becomes just necessary to evolve. So it's cool to hear. Andy, as you're talking, and I'm getting this impression that I'd just be curious. It seems like you're a very strong operator. Like you just kind of just chew through things and make it happen. Like, how would you describe yourself as a leader, worker, where your skill sets really kind of come together when leading a company? And maybe you're a extraordinary sales leader, numbers cruncher. I have no idea, but I'm just curious. Maybe you do it all, but where do you bring the most value beyond just the role of what you were doing, where your gifts really shined?
I would definitely not describe myself as an operator. In fact,
Oh,
operations
really?
is probably my
Okay.
weaker area. But I was always willing to dive in and go headfirst into the mud with the team at the factory, trying to solve problems. I was always very creative and trying to help brainstorm with the team what it took to take things to the next level. And so I was very hands-on, but I knew I cannot scale the company. And it wasn't until we went through this culture transformation, I went through my own self-reflection, said, I need to hire a proper SVP of operations. And that's when we hired Vinay Gupta in 2019. We were going through an ERP deployment, but he actually took it to completion. There were many things that we were trying to set up from an infrastructure standpoint, but it required the right leadership. And I am definitely a typical ADHD entrepreneur who's hands in a lot of pies and all over the place. But I also had to coach myself and work with my executive coach to figure out how do I step back and really delegate more to the team and not get in the details. And so I would say describe myself as a leader as much more of a, I'd say, values driven and high level leader that was very good at understanding the needs of the market, listening to customers, and reacting to various ways with new services, but really hearing and understanding the market. But once again, I read a lot of books when I went through this kind of cultural transformation. I started studying and learning and trying to find ways to become a better leader. But I said the three things that a true CEO can do well is focus on the team, culture, and strategy. And the culture piece, I was able to do a lot of things right under right guidance, and we made those changes. The team, I was always focused on recruiting. I was always very active in interviewing the first 75 or 100 hires. And we later set up a methodology called top grading, or I should say, we adopted a methodology called top grading and really came a much more thorough, robust interviewing process, incorporating our core values. That's why we were successful. But we also did a lot of things around developing talent and really building out the leadership team. And so I focused on culture, team, and then the strategy was probably the area I spent the least amount of time. But our strategy changed and grew and evolved with time. And I did choose some early strategic decisions not to work with manufacturers, to be independent as a technical advisor should. And that later morphed and changed as some of the manufacturers also went into downstream work. And we found ways to prevent conflicts of interest from emerging, and had a conflicts of interest committee to over supervise and make sure none of the issues would happen where a manufacturer and a customer would work on the same transaction. That would clearly not happen. But that upfront strategy work, I kind of grew and evolved really by listening to clients, understanding the market, and seeing where things would evolve. But once I really stepped back and just focused on those three areas and let the teams do the work, then we really grew, because I was able to hire folks that were much better than myself, and I just played a small cog in the machine and just really tried to lead and guide the team in the right direction. So it was a transformation for myself, but that's how I describe my leadership style.
It's one, I appreciate that. I mean, very clear and succinct. So I appreciate you the self-awareness. Maybe I read you wrong, and that was maybe more of a compliment. You don't maybe come off as much. Maybe you haven't spent enough time as ADHD, etc. I mean, I resonate very much with that. But there's a clarity to how you speak that just makes me think there's strong operating ability, and there probably is to a degree. Just it's not where you prefer to play at all times. So thank you for sharing. So Andy, you recently sold the company. You moved back to Boston. You're in this liminal state of transition and kind of thinking about what's ahead and how to apply this expertise. And it seems like there's a pretty big body of work here to apply to the future. Like, what's swirling around upstairs? What are you thinking about? Do share.
Yes, so there's obviously a lot of opportunities for not just renewable energy, but the broader energy transition. And there's many ways for myself to play a role in the sector. I have decided to really kind of dedicate this period of time with my family, and there was obviously a lot of transition. I have four daughters between ages of 8 and 15, and so there's a lot of options to stay busy with them. But I did travel extensively when I was running the business. I was taking a lot of late night calls, so I definitely prioritized the business over my health and my family at times. And so it's nice for a change to actually be able to go to bed at a reasonable hour and not have to wake up at 4:30 or 5 a.m. every morning. And so I'm definitely sleeping a significant amount of hours more each night. That's a pleasure. But it's also great to have really meaningful moments with my kids and really special memories to bond with them. So all those things I've not been able to do the last 17 years, as well as spend more time with my wife and really have good family memories. I still very actively talking to folks in the sector and reconnecting with new leaders who are in Boston, who I either knew before or new folks to meet. So there's definitely a lot to be done, and I will take the time to before I kind of jump in. But 2026 is right around the corner, so in the meantime, I've just been able to focus at home and really my health, and it's been nice to take a break because since I talked about that story of Handy Andy's lawn care services when I was the age of 12, I've pretty much been hustling for the last 37 straight years. So I've never really formally taken a break. So that's why I put on my LinkedIn profile, I'm taking a sabbatical, and it is nice to take a break and make a change where I could really take a step back and think more strategically. And I was actually just weaning with some entrepreneurs last night and having this discussion. And one of them gave me some encouraging data, and they said there was a study done of a lot of entrepreneurs who went from one business to another, and they said anyone who jumps into something within a year, that's often a bad sign. They're waiting they're jumping in too quickly. And while I've had ideas to jump in, I've captured these ideas. I've kind of tested some theses, but I've just been holding off. So I'm still holding to that year rule, and we'll see where it is. But I have invested in various companies. I'm an advisory board member, and still connected with a lot of key leaders in the industry. So I'm very eager to see how the industry will play out and grow. But there's no doubt in my mind. Doesn't matter who's in the Oval Office. Solar is going to grow here in the U.S. as well as globally, and the U.S. is going to be a key part of that. So there's a lot of areas where my skill sets, particularly on the manufacturing and supply chain side, I will think will have a meaningful impact on how the industry grows.
Well, first, congrats on just taking some time for yourself to breathe and take time to think about what's ahead strategically and not rush. I'm sure your family enjoys having dad back, and you get to cherish these memories because your kids are at a formative age, and I'm excited for you and what's ahead. Seems like you're gonna make some strong intentional moves and let it come to you. So Andy, this has been a treat. Where can people find you?
I'm pretty accessible on LinkedIn. That's the best way to reach me. Email is probably the worst, but yeah, LinkedIn's the best way to reach out to me. And I used to be very heavily involved in posting on a daily basis because it was always great to connect with my network. So I'm not probably as active on LinkedIn as I once was, but I do respond to messages there, and do intend to stay active and trying to help mold and drive change in the sector. So we'll be at occasional conference. So please, anyone can reach out to me there, or look me up if they're coming to Boston.
Awesome. Well, Andy, look forward to staying in touch, and best of luck on the next steps.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Brian. It's been a pleasure to talk today, and thanks for bringing this message out to your broader audience.
Thank you for joining us for this expansive conversation with Andy Klump. Today we learned how a single moment of unexpected scrutiny signaled the end of a defining era, and how nearly 20 years in China shaped Andy's worldview, his leadership, and his place in the global energy transition. We heard how he helped scale one of the world's largest solar manufacturers, built a multicultural advisory firm from scratch, and eventually transformed that company through values, talent, and trust. Andy also reminded us that stepping back is sometimes the boldest move of all. His decision to take a sabbatical to focus on family, health, and strategic clarity is part of a new chapter filled with space, intention, and possibility. If today's episode left you inspired, please leave us a review. Share it with someone who'd appreciate Andy's journey, and help others find the show. New episodes come out every Tuesday and Friday. We'll see you next time.